So why don't we begin with a few prayers? We can start on page 73. Praise to Shakyamuni Buddha. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. When I was supreme amongst humans who were born on this earth, you paced out 7 strides and said, I am supreme in this world. To you who were wise then, I prostrate. With pure bodies, formed supremely pure, wisdom motion like a golden mountain. Fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best, Lord, to you I prostrate. With the supreme signs, face like spotless moon, color like gold, to you I prostrate. Thus free like you, the 3 worlds are not, incomparably wise one, to you I prostrate. The Savior having great compassion, the Founder having all understanding, the field of merit with that qualities like a vast ocean, to you, the one God of thusness, I prostrate. The purity that frees one from attachment, the virtue that frees one from the lower realms. The one path is sublime pure reality, the Dharma that pacifies, I prostrate. Those who are liberated and also show the path to liberation, the holy field qualified with realizations, who are devoted to the moral precepts, to you, the sublime community intending virtue, I prostrate. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all 3 ever devout homage. To all worthy of respect, bound with bodies as many as all realms atoms in all aspects, with supreme faith I pay homage. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind thoroughly, this is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a original aberration, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew, or a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, see conditioned things as such. To these merits may sentient beings attain the rank of all seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. I prostrate to the Arya triple gem, thus did I hear at one time. The Bhagavan was dwelling on the massive Vulture's mountain in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagavan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Haryahavalokitishvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom, and beheld those 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then, through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Haryahavalokitishvara. How should any son of the lineage train wish to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom. He said that in the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Shariputra. Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage, who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom, should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty and emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, composition, and all factors in that consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are an emptiness without characteristic. Unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain. Not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, likewise, therefore in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no composition, no factors, no consciousness. No eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind. No visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object to touch, and no phenomenon. There is no high element, and so on up to including the mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, up to including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, Bodhisattvas rely on and dwell on the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the endpoint of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment and reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering should be known as a truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared, Tayata Hongate Gate Paragate Parasangate Bodhi Soha. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, should reign in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagavan arose from that concentration and committed the Bodhisattva Hare Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage, it is like that. It is like that one should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated. Even the Hatagaras rejoice. The Bhagavan, having thus spoken, the Venerable Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Hare Avalokiteshvara, and those surrounding in their entirety, along with the worlds, with the gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, are overjoyed and highly praised as spoken by the Bhagavan. So the next page, I prostrate to the gathering of the Kinis and the three chakras who abide in the holy yoga of using space. By your powers of clairvoyance and magic illumination, look after practitioners like a mother her children. For the teaching of the three supreme jewels, possessing the power of truth, may inner and outer hindrances be transformed, may they be dispelled, may they be pacified. Negative forces opposed to Dharma be completely pacified. May the host of 80,000 obstacles be pacified. May we be separated from problems and harmful conditions to Dharma. May we all enjoyments be in accord with the Dharma, and may there be auspiciousness and perfect happiness here right now. And we can skip to page. Why don't we do the foundation of all good qualities, which is on page 93. The foundation of all good qualities is the kind and perfect pure Guru. Correct devotion to him is the root of the path. By clearly seeing this and applying great effort, please let me to rely upon him with great respect. Understanding that the precious freedom of this rebirth is found only once, is greatly meaningful and is difficult to find again. Please bless me to generate the mind that unceasingly day and night has its essence. This life is as impermanent as a water bubble, and remember how quickly it decays and death comes. After death, just like a shadow follows the body, the results of black and white karma follow. Finding firm and definite conviction in this, please bless me always to be careful to abandon even the slightest negativities and accomplish all virtuous deeds. Seeking from sorrow pleasures to the door to all suffering, they are uncertain and cannot be relied upon. Recognizing these shortcomings, please bless me to generate a strong wish for the bliss of liberation. Led by this pure thought, mindfulness, alertness, and great caution arise. The root of the teachings of keeping the Patimoksha vows, please bless me to accomplish this essential practice. Just as I have fallen into the sea of samsara, so have all other migratory beings. Please bless me to see this train of supreme bodhicitta and bear the responsibility of freeing migratory beings. Even if I develop only bodhicitta, but I don't practice the 3 types of morality, I will not achieve enlightenment. With my clear recognition of this, please bless me to practice the bodhisattva vows with good energy. Once I have pacified distractions to wrong objects and correctly analyzed the meaning of reality, please bless me to generate quickly within my mind stream the unified path that while abiding in special insight. Having become a pure vessel by training in general path, please bless me to enter the holy gateway of the fortunate ones, the supreme Vajra vehicle. At that time, the basis of accomplishing the 2 attainments is keeping pure vows and samayam. As I become firmly convinced of this, please bless me to protect these vows and pledges like my life. Then, having realized the importance of the 2 stages, the instances of the Vajrayana, by practicing with get energy and picking up the 4 sessions, please bless me to realize the teachings of the Holy Guru. Like that, may the Guru show the noble path and the spiritual friends who practice it live long lives. Please bless me to pacify completely all error and hindrances. In all my life, never separated from perfect Gurus, may I enjoy the magnificent Dharma by completing the qualities of the stages and paths, make me attain the state of Vajradhara. Then we can just do the short mandala offering on page 100. Actually, yeah, it should be on the page 898. Actually, it's a different verse. Lama Damba Yunam Yoga Jida Zambe Dagi Juden Gibe Zunam Ki Julaben Zangi Duvayo Dangi Juragi Junam Ham Dada Bada Dani Gebzuji Dagi Juden Gibe Zunam Ki Julaben Zangi Duvayo Dangi Juram Zagi Junam Ham Dada Bada Dani Gebzuji Dagi Juden Gibe Zodangi Rola Bendu Dangi Dubajo. So we can begin just to sit quietly for a couple minutes before we start teaching. Okay, so welcome everybody. So today, the topic is the Four Noble Truths. As I mentioned on Thursday, we had a short teaching on the life of the Buddha. And so I said it would be good on Sunday that we do a little teaching on the Four Noble Truths, an introduction to the Buddha's teaching. Traditionally, it's said that the Buddha was enlightened on the 15th of the fourth month, and then gave his first teaching 49 days later in Varanasi. So we're doing a little early this year, 3 days later here in Bangalore. But in any case, it's a nice way to start. So the Buddha, after his enlightenment, it said that he sat near the Bodhi tree for 49 days. Different traditions presented in different ways as he was engaged in various activities during that time, but mainly was sitting in peace, wasn't yet giving teachings. And so later, when requested to teach by the god Brahma, he surveyed the world to see who was right vessel for his teaching. So he first looked to his two original teachers that he'd had while he was training, thinking that they would be suitable and ready to understand what he had realized, but recognized that they had both passed away several days prior to that time, and been reborn in the particular realms that corresponded to the meditative absorption they had been cultivating, that they had taught him. So his next option was the 5 ascetics who had been his companions during his time while he was practicing asceticism and starving himself. So it said that he walked to Varanasi. It's not really ever been clear to me how he got there so fast, because it said he sat under the Bodhi tree for 49 days. And then on the 49th day, he gave the teaching in Sarnath in Varanasi. So he got there in 1 day by walking. I'm not sure how. It said on the road that he met I think Ajita was the name of the wanderer, Nyedro, in Tibetan. He was a follower of the Ajita sect, or the Abhajikas, what's it called? There was an ancient sect of ascetics in India that no longer exists, that was alongside the Buddhists and the Jains. Ajivakas, yeah, that's right. So he belonged to that sect. And then his name in Tibetan was Nyedro. I don't remember the Sanskrit for that.
Spelling in Tibetan?
Nyedro, like going close. Nyedro. Anyway, so this Nyedro asked him, what are you? And he replied, and he said, are you a god or a man? And he replied, I am Buddha. So the Nyedro said, oh, well, very well. Good luck with that. And went on his way. So it shows that the Buddha's teaching was conducive for certain people, and there were certain people who were right to receive his teaching, but there were many who weren't yet ready to understand what he had to say. Likewise, just before he left Bodh Gaya, it said that the two merchants, they came and met him and offered him some rice and honey. And in return, they asked to be given some locks of his hair. So he gave that, but they didn't ask for any teaching. So they were just looking for a blessing. Nevertheless, when he came to Sarnath, just outside of Varanasi, then he met these 5 ascetics that he had been practicing with. And at first, of course, they were said not to be interested to talk to him because they were disgusted that he had given up the ascetic way of life. When they saw him eating, they were very offended by that. So they made a resolve together not to honor him. Although it said that of the 5 of them, so there was I know again the Tibetan names. The Tibetan name of the first one, Kamdanya, is the same as it is in Sanskrit. It's just a transliteration of it. In Tibetan, it's just simply the phonetics in Tibetan. And then Longpa. And then Mingchen is not Mahanama in Sanskrit. Remember that. Mingchen. And then Sangden, I think Bylakuppe in Sanskrit, something like that. Bhadrapala maybe. Anyway, so the Kandana actually it said that he was not so certain. They didn't kind of go along with the other when they said they weren't going to honor him. But in any case, when they saw him, they were helplessly drawn towards him. They saw this new radiance that was emitting from the Buddha, and immediately prepared him a seat, contrary to their resolve not to do so, and asked him to explain what he had realized. So he agreed, and he explained, yes, that you should no longer address me as friend, because now I am the fully awakened one. They agreed, they sat around him. And so at that point, the first thing the Buddha said, there's in the different traditions, the exact order of some of these events is a little bit mixed, at least in our tradition, in the Tibetan tradition. This first thing that he said was not actually part of the teaching, not part of the first sutra. It was simply his advice to them, which was that he had discovered the middle way, as he called it. He said there are 2 extremes. The extreme of hedonism, when people just indulge mindlessly in sense pleasures, which he had experienced as a young man in the palace, and then the extreme of asceticism, that these ascetics were following, where one tortures the body, and as a result is not conducive to any kind of meditative advancement, because the body is too uncomfortable and struggling with the difficulties of the asceticism to really have any kind of insight into things. So he had discovered what he called the middle way. So this became a strong paradigm in Buddhist philosophy, the idea of the middle way, which was later taken up by philosophical schools too, to understand the middle way in a more subtle way. And then it said that so there's 2 different ways that the order is presented here. So I'll present this because I'll certainly forget at the end once we get into the body of the teaching. But it said that in the Theravadan tradition, it seems that they understand that as soon as they saw him, the ascetics turned into Buddhist monks. That their hair fell out, and the gods offered them yellow robes, and they became Buddhist monks. Whereas in the Tibetan tradition, the understanding is that the realization they had from hearing what he said, that is what caused them to become monks. In the Tibetan tradition, it's understood that there's 10 different ways that somebody can take ordination. And one of them is simply by the force of realization, that through their perception of reality, from hearing the truth the Buddha taught, they spontaneously became Buddhist monastics. Whereas in later times, like today, the only standard way to become a monastic is to go through an ordination ceremony. So that's in place of what was there at the time of the Buddha. But during the time of the Buddha, there were various ways. The most common one was called Sershok in Tibetan, which just means come here, so that the Buddha would meet somebody and they would see that they had faith and say, come here, bhikkhu. And they would come and they would be a monk. And then there were other specific cases to specific people, like his student Karsapa, one of his greatest students, who had not accepted a teacher before because he was too, I wouldn't say proud, but he was recognized that his realization was higher than the people around him. So he hadn't accepted anybody as a teacher. But when he recognized the Buddha, he said, "You are my teacher." And that was how he became a monk, just from saying that. So various things like that. So in this case, it said that simply by the Buddha giving the teaching, these 5 ascetics became the first 5 Buddhist monastics. So then the question is, what did he teach? That is the body talk here. So the Buddha explained to them about what he called the Four Noble Truths. This was the first teaching, and we also would generally say it's the essential teaching of Buddhism. All Buddhist philosophy, all other Buddhist teachings, they all center around the Four Noble Truths. Although the Buddha gave many more advanced teachings in the future, it's not that the Four Noble Truths are transcended. It's simply different ways of understanding the same truth, or ways of enhancing the realization of that, or different supplements to help one develop one's realization. But really, the essence of Buddhist philosophy and of Buddhist practice is an understanding of the Four Noble Truths. So we say noble truths, right? This is what the Buddha called it. So the understanding here is that noble is referring to the person who realizes this truth. There was an understanding that there are beings whose awareness is, we call supramundane, beyond ordinary reality. And they see something that's a deeper truth than ordinary people see. So these are called noble beings, or Arya beings in Sanskrit. And the truths are true from the perspective of the Arya being. This is how they see things. So it said that it's not that it's not true for ordinary people, they just don't see it that way. Of course, it still functions. And so even if before people understood, for example, the laws of physics, it doesn't mean they weren't true. This means nobody really understood what was going on. So likewise, for ordinary people, these laws are still functioning. The karmic laws that are related to the Four Noble Truths, but it's just that they aren't aware of it happening. They see things quite the opposite. So it said that what the Arya sees as happiness, ordinary beings see as suffering. And what ordinary beings see as happiness, the Arya sees as suffering. So there's another nice verse by Shanti Deva also, which is not specifically about the Four Noble Truths, it's more a kind of lament, but it's related idea. So Dugo Durdu Semyo Kyang, Dugo Nila Mopar Gyuk, Dewa Do Kyang Timo Pe, Rangi Dewa Dratar Jon. This is originally a Sanskrit verse, but I don't have the Sanskrit in memory. So this is saying, although beings wish to abandon suffering, they run after the cause of suffering. And then, although they wish to achieve happiness, like their own enemy, they destroy happiness. So this is due to ignorance, it's due to misapprehension. But what are the causes of happiness, and what are the causes of suffering? So this is essentially what we need to know. If we want to be happy, we have to know what is the cause. And the example that's often given in Buddhist philosophy that the Buddha himself used at this time was that of a sick person. So if somebody is sick, then until you know the cause of your illness, it's very hard to uproot the illness. So we can interestingly look back. It's maybe quaint now to think about it, but it was not so quaint at the time. We can look at, for example, the Black Plague. Nobody knew what was causing the Black Plague up until the end of the 19th century. So during the time that it was ravaging throughout the world, not just Europe, in people of European descent, we learn about what happened in Europe, but actually it was probably just as bad or worse in India, as far as I know. They had all kinds of strange ideas about what is the cause of the plague, and so then they would address those, trying to solve the problem. So some people would blame particular classes of people and then say we need to slaughter them so that we can get rid of the plague. Some people would blame it on some kind of environmental issue. So then they would think we could manipulate the environment somehow to change things. Some people, religious extremists would blame it on the sins of humanity, and so they would go around flagellating themselves, trying to extricate the sins that were going to cause them to contract the plague. Some people then sought refuge in going on pilgrimage, which became a very strong way to spread the plague. So that didn't help, as far as we can tell. And then the academy in Paris, which was the most advanced, supposedly scientific academy at the time, came up with a very long research paper devoted to the causes of the plague that they presented to the Pope. And it had to do mainly with planetary alignment and earthquakes. So I don't think any of them quite got it on the mark as far as we know today. Who knows, but certainly today, if there's an outbreak of bubonic plague, as there is from time to time, it's pretty easily treatable with antibiotics. So it seems like we pinpointed one of the main causes anyway.
The rats who carry this-
Yeah, the rats and the fleas from the rats carried it.
It's as simple as poverty, overcrowding and unhygienic conditions.
Yeah, hygienic conditions, of
Because
course.
imagine in Surat, and today Surat
Yeah.
is the cleanest city in India.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's never we say pervasion, although it's hygienic, it can still spread. Although it does, one thing I read is that it did not, the only place in Europe, or at least one of the very few places in Europe where it was pretty well contained was in Nuremberg. And they think that's because there was fairly good sanitation there. But most of the other cities didn't take that as an example. Or maybe they thought Nuremberg, it's because of some other reason, and then they tried to copy that reason, but it wasn't the right reason. So it's a very interesting phenomenon to see what happens when people don't know the cause of something. They search and search and search, and they want to know the cause because they want to be free, and nobody wants to have the plague. It was a kind of panic at the time. So people are desperately looking for a cause and trying to treat that cause. Nowadays in the modern world, certainly we've had a lot of advancements in medicine, and we know the cause of a lot of physical diseases. So most people, when they get sick, they go to a doctor. They might also go to a priest or something like that, but usually, except in extreme cases, they also consult a doctor. Because people trust that medical science has found the cure to at least a fair amount of diseases. But when people have mental health problems, it's a bit more vague. It's a little less certain what they're going to do. I think because medical science, at least at this point, does not seem to have found quite a strong correlation between one particular cause, such as a virus, and mental instability, mental unhappiness. So people still seek out various methods. Some of them might be more efficacious than others, and there's probably evidence that some of them work better than others. But at the moment, I think in a lot of ways, it's still a bit of a dark age, just like Europe was in relation to in medical science at that time. So the Buddha, anyway, presented that this is the cause, that he has discovered the cause. And that was something that people were seeking at the time. It was an interesting time in India. I think I mentioned that on Thursday, that that was a sub-project of the culture. People in India at the time were interested in finding a release from the round of birth and death, and recognized that ordinary existence was dissatisfactory. It was a lot of people that took to asceticism at the time, trying to find a solution. And so the Buddha claimed that he had discovered this, and this is what he taught. So he presented it in the order as one would present something to a sick person. So we start with diagnosis, and then on the basis of that, we say, well, you have such and such disease. This is caused by such and such thing. So we say you have the plague. It is caused by the bubonic bacteria. Forget the name of the bacteria in Greek, but anyway, You get the point? So you then pinpoint the exact cause. And then you say, well, but fortunately, that can be cured. There's a way out of this. And then here's the regimen you need to follow. You need to take such and such medicine, follow such and such lifestyle, and that's how you'll be free of the suffering, of this illness. So that's the same way that the Buddha presented the order, starting from suffering, and then the cause of suffering, and then the release from suffering, and finally the path that leads to that release, or the practices that one cultivates to be free of that. So it's said that this order is in terms of the way someone practices it. It's not in terms of the way it arises. Right? So it's a reverse order. Really, it would be that first you have the cause, then you have suffering, then you have the path, then you have the release. But it was presented in an inverse order, and it's a way of helping people to understand it. So we start with the truth of suffering. So I think it's best today that as we go through this, we do it in the same way, because it's in terms of our own understanding of it. So in the monastery, this is one of the many points we debate endlessly about how is it really realized in this order. So there's a number of conceptual problems that come about this way, and it seems that really, to understand any of the Four Noble Truths completely, you have to understand all of them because they're interrelated. To really understand what the truth of suffering is, you have to understand how it's generated by the cause of suffering. So you can't really understand one without the other. And by understanding the cause of suffering, you immediately understand, because in Buddhist philosophy, this cause is a particular kind of wrong view, wrong understanding. Then you would understand that the right understanding is the opposite of that. And so in that sense, you understand that there's also a path of release. And you would understand that being free of that misapprehension would be a kind of freedom. So really, to understand the hard essence of all of them, any one of them, you have to understand all of them. But in terms of cultivation for one's own practice, in terms of contemplating about suffering and thinking about what is suffering, that has to be the first step, because if we really want to be free of suffering, first we have to know what it is. We won't have any desire to be free of it if we don't even recognize it. So this is what the Buddha started with. It was to say that, first of all, we need to actually understand how deep our suffering goes. It's not just so simple. So in that sense, it's kind of like bad news from the doctor. You go to a doctor saying, I have a headache, thinking maybe he'll give me some migraine medicine or something like that. And the doctor looks closely and says, well, actually you have brain cancer. So it's a lot worse than you thought. But you have to know that first in order to actually want to be free of that problem. So likewise here, the Buddha is saying, okay, yes, this suffering you experience day to day, this upset in your life, anxiety, depression, or whatever other problems you have, that's just a symptom of a much deeper underlying cause that is not just tied to a few small events or a few things that we can simply tweak in your system and make it better. So this is why in Buddhist practice, of course, practitioners who are very serious will make this their full-time occupation. Either they'll ordain as monastics or even as lay people will do very intensive practice over a long period of time because they recognize that this isn't something that can simply be dispelled with a little bit of tweaking here and there. So the Buddha said, this is suffering. And when he said that, he gave examples. He said, birth is suffering, aging is suffering, sickness is suffering, death is suffering. These are things that we can all relate to. It's not really deniable. Some people might say birth isn't suffering. Some people might say birth is a wonderful thing. It's the start of new life. So what did he mean when he meant birth was suffering? A few different things. Well, first of all, At that time, there was no anesthetics, right? There was just natural childbirth, we might say. In pre-modern times, I think 1 in 100 childbirths would end in the death of the mother. So that was pretty grim chances. If you have 7 or 8 children, then you have a fairly good, not good chance, but not a negligible chance certainly of dying, even if you don't die. What?
Like in our 2-3 generations before, they
Yeah.
would have like 8-10 children, out of which 3 or 4 would
Oh, the
die.
3 or 4 children. Well, I was just talking about the mother first of all, but then of course, then the children even more. Probably if you had in ancient times, unless you were very wealthy, and even if you were very wealthy, but especially if you weren't, then probably most of your children would die. It's not something that we see in a lot of history books directly, because it was, for one thing, it was just kind of taken for granted. And secondly, the people who died as babies didn't usually make the history books, understandably. But it does seem that in pre-modern times, it was just a very common sight to walk along the road and see babies just discarded along the side of the road. So this was a normal part of life. So nowadays, we don't see that so much. But nevertheless, from what I've heard anyway, not having been party to it myself since I was born, that childbirth is a pretty uncomfortable experience for anybody. And especially for the baby too. We sometimes think how cute it is when the baby comes out, but they're not usually smiling themselves. So this was recognized as something, as one of the 4 fundamental sufferings of life. But also beyond the physical suffering, there's simply the fact that, yes, it's the start of a new life. That means it's the start of a new progression towards death. That might seem a little grim, but again, the Buddha was just trying to present things in a different light to see this is what's actually happening. We don't want to think about it that way because we try to look on the bright side of things. And the Buddha wasn't trying to make us pessimistic. The point was that if there was no freedom from this, there was no way out of it, then probably it wouldn't be so useful to dwell on these issues. It'd be better just to enjoy life as much as we can. That's a pretty common view. It was a common view then. It's probably even more common view now. That there's not really anything we can do about it. So we just try to make the best use of the time while we can, and spend as much time as possible enjoying what we can in life. But that was not the Buddha's approach. For him, that was just not possible. He was too preoccupied with these issues, even as a prince. His father wanted him to be distracted and just enjoy himself. But he couldn't put these things out of his mind. You could say he was a very serious person. Nevertheless, he felt that this was something worth pursuing because there was something better. So it didn't have to be this way. So he first had to generate what we call in Tibetan kind of shenlok. So shenlok literally means turning away from adherence. So you're very strongly clinging to something, and then you turn away from it. But also the word shenlok, at least in colloquial, can mean a kind of revulsion, you would say in English. So it has the same connotation as English does, of a kind of almost like wanting to vomit. So that you see something and you develop a strong sense of repulsion towards it, that it almost makes you sick. So this is what we're trying to cultivate in Buddhist philosophy, in Buddhist practice, is the things that usually we see as pleasant and worth pursuing, we see quite the opposite, that we see it as a kind of trap, that we turn away from this. So the suffering of birth, and then the suffering of old age, which is self-evident. But again, it's something that we don't try not to think about. We think it'll happen later. Why not? Why waste my youth worrying about my old age? Then I lose 2 times, right? I suffer in youth and in old age. Better I wait until I'm old and then I can deal with that problem. But again, the Buddha said that doing that in the end it only leads to greater suffering because you're trying to see things, not see things as they are. And so the more that you try to blind yourself from reality, then the more suffering you will experience when reality exposes itself to you. We have to first be grounded in what's actually happening. So old age is just what happens as a body naturally moves away from birth, and then sickness, and finally death. So in Buddhist philosophy, we talk a lot about death. It's one of the most important aspects of contemplation, thinking about what it means to die, thinking about the experience of death itself, the time leading up to it, the anxiety that one experiences, the sense of despondency and other issues that come, the strong sense of clinging to family, to things that we were once attached to, and objects of comfort. And then also the question of what happens after death. It's a very pertinent question, and something that, of course, some people would say, well, we don't have an answer. We don't really know. Generally in science, the understanding is that a negative hypothesis is a scientific hypothesis, right? That to say I think there is nothing after death is a scientific scientific position, and then we can look for counter evidence. But to say that I believe in something after death is non-scientific because it can never be disproven. We can always say, well, I never seen anything, but I could always believe that there's something else. So here, there's an understanding of there might be ways to understand, well, what could happen, right? I think if we have time, it's certainly something worth talking more about. Maybe I shouldn't get into it too much in the initial time. But oftentimes when I have more time to talk, for example, weekend teachings, I try to present various forms of contemplation about this, both the traditional ones and things based on modern understanding, because this is very central. Right? The Buddha is saying that we're looking for a release from the cycle of birth and death. He's not just saying we're looking for a release from day-to-day tribulations. So that first requires establishing that such a thing is likely true. Why spend your whole life trying to be free of the cycle of birth and death if you just disappear when you die and you didn't really accomplish a whole lot? So Buddhist philosophy is very much grounded in an understanding of consciousness being something that is not tied to a single body, a single lifetime. And the understanding of the cause of suffering, likewise, has a lot to do with more than just the experience of this life. If we look for the cause of suffering simply in the events of this life, either in the psychophysical aspects of the body itself, looking in the brain, looking at balance of hormones, things like this, or at events in this life. So example, childhood traumas, other things like that. We might gain some insight, but it's not really addressing the totality of what's going on. And so without that, we can't really address how to extirpate the cause, because we've only identified a very small piece of it. So that's something maybe worth discussing a little later, but I'll continue on here, at least in general, with this explanation, and then later, especially if people express interest, we can talk more about that. So that was the essential presentation of suffering, of those four aspects of birth, old age, sickness, and death. And the Buddha also added on a few other things. For example, so he said birth is suffering, aging is suffering, Sickness is suffering, death is suffering. Likewise, he said, being separated from the pleasant is suffering. Right? This is just something undeniable. This is what happens to us all the time. We are attached to a particular object, be it a particular person, a particular like a car or wealth, some kind of physical thing, or our young body, or our healthy body, any kind of thing that we think gives us some kind of stability, and having this brings us what we perceive to be happiness. We'll experience separation from that at some point, sooner or later. So that is suffering. And likewise, then meeting with the unpleasant is suffering. So the corollary of that, separation from the pleasant, meeting with the unpleasant. We don't want to see this person ever again. We never want to have such and such disease, but eventually it might happen. There's the anxiety of anticipating it because we never know for sure. And then there's the suffering of actually encountering it. Now the Buddha said that as for being separated from things that are pleasant, sometimes we have the idea that we have this pleasant thing and it's pretty stable while we have it. It's only until some factor comes along, some external factor comes along and separates us from it, that we actually become separate from it. So for example, I guess I can use the example of a car because that's something that's very precious to many people these days. We get a new car. It's just a matter of, as long as we can shield it from the elements that will cause it to deteriorate, so rain, weather, other weather-related issues, and then potholes in the road, various kinds of accidents that can occur. Now, of course, if we really want to do that, we may as well just lock the car in the garage all the time. But assuming we could do that, we think, well, then I can shield it because it won't get harmed. But actually, the Buddha said that the main cause of something deteriorating is it's being produced. If it was never produced, of course, it wouldn't deteriorate. But as soon as it's produced, because that production is itself a dynamic process, it's not that this poof, it's there out of nowhere. It's something that comes into play through a variety of causes and conditions, an interplay that's itself a dynamic process, a continuing process. So it's not there, then there the next moment, but actually it's gradually coming into being, and then its process of passing away has already begun. So if you just keep the car in the garage, it might take a little longer, depending, but it'll gradually deteriorate. It's made out of ordinary elements that don't last forever. And especially the interplay of them, right? So the metal in the car might last for thousands and thousands of years, as long as it doesn't rust. But it being connected with all of the different parts of the car in a way that allows it to function, that's something that's just in a process of change, will in and of itself deteriorate, whether somebody does something external that comes along and smashes it with a hammer or not. So likewise, even more so with the body, right? You can't lock your body in the garage. You need to feed it all the time. It's constantly in need of sustenance to maintain it, stop it from deteriorating too fast. But it's in a constant process of deteriorating. So we don't see things as they really are. This comes back to the original point. We perceive it as my body is pretty stable. I have a sense of myself. And therefore, when I look in the mirror one day and I see wrinkles and gray hair, it's surprising. What happened? Well, actually, that's very natural. It'd be more surprising if that didn't happen. It would actually be kind of frightening. Some of you might know there's a famous novel in England, The Picture of Dorian Gray. This is exactly what happened, that Dorian Gray stayed young for a very long time due to his played a little trick where he asked the portrait of himself to get old while he stayed young. So that was quite an odd phenomenon, and it actually ended up causing him more suffering than had he accepted the inevitability of his own decline. So it's just the way of things. And that's just the natural state of the body. But because we want it to be otherwise, or even have a sense that it is otherwise, then it's shocking and discomforting when when it occurs naturally. So the Buddha gave the example in one of the discourses, the sutras. He said, if somebody were to throw a dart into your arm, how painful would that be? He said, that would be very painful. He said, what if after that, somebody were to throw a second dart into the exact same spot? So that would be 10 times as more painful as the first dart. This is already a wound. So he said, likewise, it's enough suffering simply to experience physical suffering. Then to have the mental suffering compounding that, wishing it would be otherwise, this is like the second dart. It makes it 10 times worse to try to resist it and then want it to be something other than actually what it is. So the Buddha, in response to this, because he was selling this to a particular person who was suffering terribly at the decline of his body, he said, therefore, sir, you should train yourself. If you train your mind through meditation, the physical suffering may not go away, but the mental suffering you can definitely deal with. So we have meeting with the unpleasant and separation from the pleasant. And then the seventh one is not finding what one wants despite searching. So this is the perennial story of human history. People want something, they go searching for it, they don't find it. Or they find it, they keep it for a little while, and it's gone. Or they find it, and it's not exactly what they wanted. It has the opposite effect. It actually makes things worse. And then sometimes it's said there's an eighth suffering, which is that, as the Buddha said, the appropriating aggregates, in short, are suffering. Meaning this body and mind we have is itself suffering. It's in the nature of suffering. So this is a much more subtle teaching. This has to do with an understanding of suffering being something more than just the physical, not physical, but say, the sensation of suffering, either physical or mental. So this ties into another way of contemplating suffering, which is what we call the three kinds of suffering. So the Buddha explained this as a way of understanding suffering more deeply. So the first kind of suffering is what I've already been talking about. It's the suffering of suffering, which sounds tautological, but the point is that it's the suffering of the sensation of suffering. So we have different kinds of sensations. We have pleasant sensations, suffering sensations, and neutral sensations. So among those, we usually would say the pleasant sensation is pleasant, is happiness. The suffering sensation is suffering. So the Buddha generally agreed. He didn't say we need to change the names, but we have to look at them in a deeper way. What is their final nature? So the suffering of suffering is the feelings that we usually identify as suffering. But then we have what's called the suffering of change. And that is what we usually call feelings of happiness and pleasure. So the Buddha did not deny that they're feelings of pleasure. Sometimes people misunderstand this. The suffering of change is pleasure. But it's the suffering of change in the sense that it's changing. And that means two different things. One is that any feeling of pleasure will eventually change into a feeling of suffering. So this is a bit more subtle, but it's fairly easy to understand once we give it some thought. So imagine, for example, like today, it's a pretty hot day outside. So it's uncomfortable experiencing the heat. So you go into an air-conditioned office. So you step inside and it's cool. And that's a feeling of pleasure. This change from hot to cold. So that's called the suffering of change. So why? It's pleasant. We might even dream about that. We might have a dream where we're thinking how nice it would be to be in a nice cool environment, have a nice cold drink, enjoy yourself. But if it was truly happiness, you should be able to experience it continuously. So if you come in from the hot and sit in the cold room, you should be able to sit there indefinitely for hours, days at a time, and just feel this wonderful sensation of being cold. But that's not what happens. Most likely, if you sit there long enough, you'll start feeling cold, and it'll be unpleasant. So it's really not that the cold itself is a happy feeling. It's that in comparison to the heat, it is experienced as happiness. So the Buddha essentially said that any experience of suffering, any experience of happiness that we ordinarily have is no different from this. This is the nature of what it means to be a pleasant sensation. It means a reduction of some sort of suffering. So, to use a rather coarse example, but it is a very good example, would many people think that this is that it's happiness to think, I'm just going to drink and drink and drink as much as I need until I really need to go to the bathroom. And then it's just going to be so wonderful when I release that all. But that's basically what our normal experiences of happiness are. We build up some kind of tension until something is very uncomfortable, and then we release it with the opposite sensation. Whereas wouldn't it be nice just not to have to experience that at all? So another example that's a modern Buddhist monk I saw gave, it's very nice. So it's like there were 3 children who came upon a magic lamp. We have this famous example of the genie's lamp, right? So the first child, the genie asked, "What would you wish for?" And he says, "I wish I could have 10,000 ice cream cones." So he gave 10,000 ice cream cones and looked so happy. So the second child was jealous, and so he asked, "Well, I want 1,000,000 ice cream cones." Give 1,000,000 ice cream cones. And the first child, who first had 10,000, was now disappointed because the second one had 1,000,000. So the third child, looking at the first two and seeing them bickering back and forth, he said, "I wish I was so happy that I never needed another ice cream cone in my life." So wouldn't that be more pleasant? Wouldn't it be nice that you don't actually, whether you get an ice cream cone or not, you're still perfectly happy? It shouldn't be so dependent upon something exterior to yourself. And again, this example of the ice cream cone is the same point. That what's so pleasant about an ice cream cone? Well, it's cold, it's sweet. Yes, that's true. But if you're already freezing cold, it's probably not very pleasant. It's only that pleasant when you're hot. The sweetness, yes, that's a little more subtle. However, if we're not conditioned to that kind of sweetness, it might not taste very good. It has to do a lot with what we've conditioned ourselves to over time. The first time somebody tastes an ice cream cone, maybe not so much in our culture because people have already had sweet things. But if you were to give an ice cream cone, for example, to somebody who lived in a very traditional society where there's no processed food, they might find the taste quite strange. It's only after eating it a few times that they start to think, "Oh, that's a good taste," and label that, and then want to experience that again. And then when we're separated from it, we think, "I haven't had an ice cream cone in so long. I think I'll die if I don't have another one soon." If we never had it in the first place, there's no way we would have such a thought. And then, of course, there's the issue with the ice cream cone, that the more you eat it, it unfortunately doesn't make your body more comfortable. If you eat 10 ice cream cones a day for 20 years, it's unlikely to bring you some kind of stable happiness. It's quite likely to be the opposite, that your body starts getting all kinds of health problems. So if it was real happiness, it should just be pure happiness. You just keep taking it and feel more and more happy. But when you look at 10 ice cream cones on a plate and it looks, wow, that looks so delicious. But as you eat it, you just start to feel more and more regret and more stomach discomfort. So it doesn't, it's like we say, a honey-coated razor blade. It's tempting you but it doesn't deliver what you might expect, or what it shows that it's going to deliver. So this is the suffering of change. This is a very important object of meditation to think about the different things that we consider happiness, and are they happiness in and of themselves, or are they basically no different from this example of trying to drink a lot and make yourself go to the bathroom? Is that the essential nature of any kind of ordinary happiness that we have? So the Buddha said that this happiness, this suffering of change that he'd identified, this was not unique to his teaching. That essentially the other ascetics that he was teaching, other practitioners in India, they'd recognized the same thing. This is why they distanced themselves from ordinary experiences of happiness, seeking something more stable, something more meaningful that would be a permanent form of happiness. So some of them then pursued kind of experiences of bliss within meditation, but that was still connected with this suffering of change, because it's the same issue fundamentally, although it's a subtler, more refined, in some ways more stable kind of happiness, because you don't need so many external props. You can just experience this yourself in your own personal bliss of your meditation. It's still a conditioned phenomenon, and so it can't last forever. It might seem like it's going to, and it might last a long time, but it still has to do with certain causes. The causes of that bliss are not, it's not just something self-perpetuating. It's using certain causes that are built up in one's mental consciousness, and so at a certain point that will exhaust itself, and eventually the mind will return to a different state. So some of the teachers, even at the time, had recognized that. His early teachers had also taught him to access a state that was beyond this. They had recognized that this ordinary meditative bliss was a kind of disturbance of the mind. The mind is still fundamentally disturbed because it's attached to the bliss. So we're trying to find, instead of bliss, a kind of mental peace, just a pure neutrality, where the mind is at rest. And this is what they had taught him, and what he had ultimately rejected. And now this is what he identified as the third kind of suffering, which is identical to what I just said was the eighth suffering, if you recall, when I gave this list of 8: birth, old age, sickness, death, separation from the pleasant, meeting with the unpleasant, not finding what you wish despite searching, and finally, the aggregates themselves. So this is another way of understanding this. This third kind of suffering he called pervasive compounded suffering, which is talking about one's ordinary body and mind. So what this means is that simply having a body and mind, or even just one part of that combination, so even just having a mind, so thinking that we could be born in some kind of realm where we no longer experience physicality, it's just pure mentality, which is what the teachers were espousing at the time. It's still under the power of past conditioning. So in that sense, it's only going to ripen as those prior two kinds of suffering, either the suffering of suffering or the suffering of change. As long as we have a body and mind that we don't control, that's always a possibility. So we could think, I'm going to be born in this wonderful realm, this heavenly realm, where there's just complete peace. And I hope I'm never reborn back on earth or back in ordinary existence. But is that possible? It's still dependent upon something else. It's dependent upon our being separated from that. And so the Buddha said that this is still not freed from this entire cycle. Although it's kind of like being at the eye of the storm, it hasn't been completely freed from it, because the mind is still under the power of delusion. And when the cycle turns again and past imprints in the mind ripen, then again one will experience those, and without any kind of barrier against them. There hasn't been any real transcendence, because there hasn't been really any real insight into the nature of things. It's simply a stopping, like a withdrawal. So the Buddha said this is still within suffering. It's of these three sensations that we talked about. There's unpleasant or suffering sensations, then pleasant sensations, then neutral sensations. This is talking about neutrality. So simply going to sleep. It's still we're still not free. This is said to be the most difficult one to recognize, and the one that his prior companions had not previously recognized. So that is we had within suffering, first we talked about the 4 or 8 kinds of suffering. There's birth and so forth. And then the 3. There's also a couple other ways to talk about suffering, because it's such an important subject. So this pervasive compounded suffering is very subtle. It's the most important one to understand. And understanding it will necessarily help us to understand the second truth, the truth of the origin. Because essentially what pervasive compounded suffering is meaning. So pervasive in the sense that it pervades every experience that we could possibly have within ordinary existence. The word compounded is quite different. The word compounded means that it is propelled by the force of past action and past thought. Every experience we have is the ripening of a past action or a past thought that we've had. And that then ripens as an experience in the present. So if we understand this, we understand pervasive compounded suffering, and simultaneously we understand the origin. That this something that is propelling this. So we'll get into that a little later. And if we understand this, then we also understand that, well, if it was possible to be free of that experience, of that creation of further action, further thought, in the sense of not just thought in any kind of thought, that's an important point, but essentially deluded thought, wrong understandings, things that are based on a misapprehension of things, then there might be some possibility of freedom. But because it's so subtle, it's not usually something that we would just talk about easily in an introductory talk. So the other way of presenting suffering is called the 6 kinds of sufferings. This is a little bit more accessible. It's just really another way of understanding the suffering of suffering, but in a way that we can contemplate and think from different angles about things. This is an important part of our tradition, is that everything we have to contemplate from many different angles, essentially because our delusions are also coming from many different angles. We're very sophisticated, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. All of us in the modern world have gone through education to whatever extent. You might think, oh, I'm not that educated, I just went to high school, but that's quite a lot, really. Your mind is very conditioned to see things in many different ways. And we have a lot of preconceptions about things. It's not necessarily bad, but at the same time, it means that we need a lot of different ways of thinking about things to change our mental framework. It's not so easy that we can just delete years and years of conditioning. We need to address things based on different ways of contemplating. And so we'll go through the 6 kinds of suffering, and then that will probably finish the first session, and we'll have a break. So more than half the talk maybe will be on suffering, but as I said, that is the essential point. If we understand suffering, then the other points will fall into place quite naturally. So the 6 kinds of sufferings, this essentially is taking for granted the idea of reincarnation. Without that, then the 6 kinds of suffering don't make a lot of sense. So as I said, in Buddhist philosophy, reincarnation is, for the most part, axiomatic. It wasn't something that the Buddha was radically departing from current thinking at the time. The other sects of religious sects and ascetic sects at the time in India for the most part, accepted reincarnation. There were a few minor exceptions. And so it wasn't something that he needed to establish separately. Now, as I just said before, nowadays, it's not so easy. A lot of people have questions about it. In Indian culture, I would expect it's a little bit more amenable because it is part of the traditional culture, than much more so than it would be in my country. Nevertheless, people who have exposure to a lot of modern thinking might have a lot of questions about it, and that's perfectly fine. That's actually a good thing. Like with everything, we really should question it and look deeply into what does it really mean. Even if it's true, it's not a question of true or false. It's also a question of in what way, what does it really mean? There might be different ways of understanding it, some of them closer to the truth than others. So I won't get into it right now. As I said, if people express interest, we can talk about it later. But for the interest of explaining the subject at hand, we'll just take that as the grounding, and later we can talk about whether it makes sense. So in terms of the 6 kinds of suffering, the first one is the suffering of uncertainty. So this can also be understood in this life. It's mainly talking about future lives, but it's essentially that we never know what's going to happen next. We have no way to control it. So in this life, that's also quite evident. I can say that when this talk finishes, I'm going to get on a bus and go back to my monastery. We can talk about, and then I'll hopefully come back here next month and maybe give some more talks. Who knows if that's really going to happen? I could go out and trip on the stairs and break my neck. Then on the way to the bus, we could have an accident. The bus could be in an accident. All kinds of things could happen. There's just absolutely no way to control that. We can make it a little bit less likely to happen, and it's probably a good idea to do that. We don't want to just be reckless, but nevertheless, in the end, we can't really control it. And even more so in terms of what happens after death. If there's a future lifetime, we can't just say, I'd like to be born in such and such place, and it'll just naturally happen. We go all over the place. We could be born, we might be very wealthy and comfortable now, but there's no guarantee whatsoever that will be the same in the future. So that's the suffering of uncertainty. The next one is the suffering of lack of satisfaction. That no matter how much pleasure we have, it's never enough. That's pretty obvious too. I don't know of anybody who said, well, I had such a wonderful night tonight. I enjoyed myself so much. I'm done. That's great. Never need to go out again, have another nice night out. I can just live the rest of my life remembering that one night, and that's enough for me. You might sometimes feel that way in the morning, but by the next day, it probably is worn off, or within a few weeks. So, both within this life, and then likewise, if we think about it in terms of many lifetimes. Usually, people, when they're dying, don't say, well, I've had a great life. That was enough for me. I don't think it could have possibly been better. I watched a very interesting short documentary recently. It was quite moving for only 18 minutes, but I thought it was quite nice. It was about an elderly man who was a philosopher, and how he was experiencing his last days. And one of the interesting things he said, which I thought very much illustrates this point, he said, I had a very strong philosophy, then the idea that that one should just accept death when it comes. He'd actually written a book about this when he was a young man. And he was at this point 97. His body was very fragile. His wife had already died. And he said, despite all this, although it doesn't make any sense to me rationally, I just feel like I just like to be here a little bit longer. I don't want to die now. So that is the natural state of the mind. This is what the Buddha was teaching. And I don't guarantee that everyone's going to say that. But I think it's useful to look at how frequently that might happen. That there's always a sense, because the mind is habituated to having pleasure. So if we spend our entire lives, every time we have some pleasurable experiencing, then think about the next one, it's going to be very hard at the time of death to say, well, now I'm ready to go. I'm just going to give it all up. If we haven't cultivated that kind of mental state previously. So that's the lack of satisfaction. The next ones especially are directly related to the understanding of reincarnation. So one of them is the suffering of having to constantly give up one's body. Right, so that if we might think, if we have some belief in reincarnation, well, that's so wonderful. I can just live again and again and have all kinds of wonderful experiences. But really, that means we're going to have to die again and again and again, and constantly just throw away this body. So the Buddha said that if we could measure all the past bodies we've had, we put those skeletons together, it would be taller than the highest mountain in the world. And the next one is very similar. It's the suffering of having to be born again and again. So you die and then having to go through the whole process again. You're thrust into another womb, start all over again. The traditional Buddhist teachings say that usually a baby in the womb will have some idea of what's going on. For the first few months of experience in the womb, we'll have a recollection of the previous lifetime. But especially the trauma of birth itself, and then gradually the process of being integrated into this life, those memories will slowly fade. In some cases, we see that it does linger on, at least reportedly so. This is something to question about what's really going on, but there are undeniably cases of people who report that, young children who report recollection of who I was before. But in any case, the teachings here say that a young baby in the womb will have a sense of, well, here we go again. Just starting all over again, the whole process. But we get so caught up in this life that that insight doesn't really last very long. But it's something here that we cultivate to think about. What's so wonderful about that? Of just going through this whole process again and again. Think about all the years you spent going through the tribulations of education and growing up and all the difficulties involved in that. So I want to just go through all of that again. What's it going to bring again? And then the fifth one is constantly going from low to high and high to low. So constantly cycling. In one lifetime, we might be very wealthy, very comfortable. The next life, we might be very poor. In one lifetime, we might be a human being. The next life, we might be some other kind of sentient being that doesn't have the opportunities that human beings have. We want to say, well, how do we know? Well, we look outside, and there are many people around here who are much less well off than we are. And look around on the floor at the different insects and maybe some rats outside, things like that. Right? Why is there some kind of guarantee that the next time I'm guaranteed I'm going to have a good rebirth and that rat is going to stay as a rat? What is the particular rule around that guarantees that? So we have to consider that. So the idea is that it's constantly cycling around and around. Nothing can stay in a positive state all the time. And then the sixth one is the suffering of being without a companion. This is something that might seem quite depressing, but also is worth considering, is that nobody can really come with us at the time of death. We go from one life to the next alone. We don't go with a whole crowd of companions that we go together. And even in one lifetime, there's no guarantee that the people that are with us now will always be there with us. So we're left with ourselves. We have to deal with our own minds. If we cultivate our minds in a way that we're content and happy, then it won't matter so much what changes externally. But if our happiness is very much tied in with particular people, particular circumstances, then it's very fragile. So these are the contemplations about the truth of suffering. That, as I said at the beginning, it's meant to turn the mind towards an interest in spiritual practice, to confront us with the reality of our situation such that we think, I would really like it to be different. It's not just about dwelling on it and thinking how miserable this is, and I don't want to have to think about that. If it was the case, as I said before, then probably it would be better just not to think about it if there was no alternative. But the Buddha said, fortunately, there is an alternative. It's possible to change this. First, we have to develop some kind of, as I said before, shenwok, some revulsion with it, some thought that what we usually think as something to grasp at actually have the opposite experience, where we think this really isn't helping me. These things that I usually conceive of as the causes of my happiness aren't reliable and aren't bringing the kind of happiness that I was seeking. So maybe there's something different to pursue. So with that, we can have a break. Although maybe I should ask, I don't want to keep everybody because I imagine some people might want a break. But if there's pressing questions about what I've said, maybe it's good to address those as long as it's fairly concise. Otherwise, yeah, it's good then we can have a break now for about 15 minutes and come back at 11 to discuss the remainder of the topics.
Do they even take the snacks and the use their plates and maybe ask also questions if they want to interact?
Yeah, of course, that's
Of
perfectly
course,
fine.
you'll also be having your snacks.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Is there in the chat? Does it look like there's one chat?
Hi, thank you.
Thank you.
No questions from my side. We'll join back at them.
Okay. So why don't we begin? So we talked about the truth of suffering a bit. As I said, I hope it was not too depressing. But that if we understand the other truths, then it actually can be a liberating understanding. Even though at first it might be experienced as unpleasant, uncomfortable. But if we don't see our present situation as uncomfortable, then there's not going to be any impetus to change it. So that's why we take time to think about it from many different angles. So we began by talking about the example of a sick person. So you recognize that you have these symptoms. You want to be free of them. I think this doesn't seem like an ideal situation. Being here, experiencing birth, experiencing old age, experiencing sickness, experiencing death, and then in between that time, experiencing this constant cycling between being attached to something and then being separated from it, being averse to something and then meeting it despite trying to avoid it. So is there an alternative? And so first we have to see is that what's the cause? Why are we here? This is the fundamental question of many philosophies. Why are we here? Except the question is asked in a quite different angle. Right? It's not just an abstract idea. What is the meaning of life? What is it all about? It's specifically, why is it like this? Why is it so full of suffering? This is the question that most religions address. That's why we have religions. People want to find an answer, to suffering. And some religions might find a better answer than others. It's hard to know unless we really examine it closely. But in Buddhist philosophy, there's definitely a distinction between some answers are more accurate and thereby more conducive to eradicating the cause because they pinpoint it more directly. So this understanding of the cause of suffering often is presented in terms of the opposite of four misapprehensions. So by looking at those, we can start to see what was the insight the Buddha was discussing. So the first misapprehension is the idea of there is no cause. This is not as inane as it might sound at first. This is actually, in my opinion, probably what most people believe, in the sense that they would say, well, yes, so if I cut my hand, the cause was the knife. If I have a cold, the cause was the virus. There's no deeper cause than that. And they might even back it up with a lot of argumentation that really why we're here is just a random aggregation of atomic processes that have no personal investment in the matter. Nobody really cares. The universe is just a cold place. And this is a very common philosophy these days, and often presented as the inevitable, something that we have to come to grips with. If we don't accept this, then we're just being idealistic. So it's something worth really taking a lot of time to think about. Is it so self-evident? Is it so obvious that any thinking person would adopt this idea? What are the reasons behind it? Well, what is the reason to think that everything that occurs is simply a random collection of atoms? Actually, does anybody have an answer to that question? It's an important thing to think about. So if somebody, you could hypothetically say, takes that position, you could take that position yourself and say, yes, everything that happens, everything that we experience is just completely random. There's no meaning behind it. Well, how do we know? Right, so we said before that what makes something a scientific hypothesis is that it's falsifiable. Right, so technically, believing that there's no life after death is a scientific hypothesis. Believing that there is easy to ground in scientific hypothesis because it's not very easily falsifiable. We could always say, as much as there's no evidence that I've found for life after death, I still believe in it. Lack of evidence doesn't disprove it. But if it could be conclusively proven that the mind is the product of the brain, then it would fairly well dismiss the idea that there is life after death, and thereby prove that there is no life after death. And so likewise, more to the point, and it's a bit of a mistake to say it that way. If we have the hypothesis that there is no life after death, it could be falsifiable by finding evidence that there is, right? So in that sense, it's a scientific hypothesis. Now, likewise, if we have the hypothesis that everything is just a random aggregation of atoms, well, is that a falsifiable hypothesis? I suppose if we were to discover a creator God who is pulling the strings, then it would falsify it. But is that the only possibility of that alternative to the idea that everything is completely random and that our existence in this present human body is simply the the progression of many previous physical processes. So you mentioned karma, right? Is that what you said?
Yeah, that's the other possibility.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a question. Is you might say, well, science has proven that there is no karma. What would we say if somebody was to if we were to defend that hypothesis? What would we say? What proof is there? Either that everything is completely random, or that there is no such thing as reincarnation and karma. Anyone have an answer?
You can't prove that there's no reincarnation or karma.
Well, that's a good point. But my question is, even if we don't necessarily believe this hypothesis, if we were to try to defend it, how might one defend it? If I was to wanting to say everything is just purely random, right, which seems to be a very commonly held view, then people who have that view must have some reason for believing it.
There's no permanent agent, external agent.
There's no permanent external agent, meaning there's like no creator God, is the point?
Yeah, no creator God or some other.
Well, why not?
Because then things won't change.
And things wouldn't change.
Things won't get reduced.
Would it get produced or reduced?
Produced.
Produced, yeah. Well, if that's a good point, that if we could argue that if the creator is something permanent, unchanging, then it could never create anything, because a permanent thing can't do the action of creating things. Otherwise it would itself have to undergo some kind of change. So there are conceptual problems with the idea of a permanent creator God. I think, from looking at this argument, one of the strongest arguments for there being, for science, we say scientific materialism or physicalism, the idea that everything that exists is reducible to physical processes that can be measured by scientific devices, is that the hypotheses that have been made based on this assumption have worked very well. Newton's physics was very effective, much more effective than, not even more effective, but categorically different than any philosophy of the material world that had gone before. It made accurate predictions. What?
Right? That has cause and effect.
Yeah, exactly. It made accurate predictions of cause and effect. So it seems to be on the right track. And the assumption of physicalism has allowed us to explain a lot of things in a very detailed way. That's quite difficult to refute. So the idea that there is some kind of non-physical entity that is mind, that is the only thing in the universe that has some kind of different property than everything else we see throughout infinite space, it seems quite unlikely. Not only unlikely, but maybe conceptually incoherent. How could a non-physical entity interact with a physical world, a world that experiences physical causes? Right? If everything, we say an action has an equal and opposite reaction, right? So how can a non-physical entity have any causal power within a world that is based on physical processes? This is one of the strong arguments, or sorry, I don't want to say strong, but common arguments at least. It's worth considering, right? It's something I've thought a lot about, because we want to consider every possibility. We don't want us to be naive and say, no, I don't accept scientific materialism, I believe in reincarnation. We want to really understand why someone might have that view. And is there any kind of error in that thinking, or at least not error, but room for uncertainty? And even if there's room for uncertainty, it's a question of how big is the uncertainty. There's sometimes the argument that we call God of the gaps, that if there's one little piece where it's not entirely certain, I say, therefore my hypothesis is correct because it must explain that. Well, how deep is the uncertainty, and in what regard? So I don't have time to get into that now, unfortunately, but it is something really worth considering as we think about the cause of suffering, because this is a serious matter. asking somebody to accept this cause of suffering and thereby act in accordance with the understanding of that being the cause, we want to get it right. We don't want to just accept it blindly. So it's something to think about, this first idea. So saying suffering is purely random, it doesn't just mean, of course, a materialist viewpoint would be it's not that there's no causes to things, it's just that those causes have nothing to do with individual personalities. Right? My experiencing suffering now, for example, say I have multiple sclerosis or some other kind of congenital disease, right? There's a cause of that. It has to do with genes that I inherited from my parents. But the point is, it has nothing to do with me. It is not like I did something wrong in this or a past life. My experience of suffering is nobody really cares. There's no rule maker in the universe that said you must experience this for this and this reason. It's just a random aggregation, and I label it as me. And I experience suffering because I think I want it to be something different than it is. So in that sense, it's saying there's no cause in terms of philosophically. You can't really make a philosophy based on human interests. Human interests don't play into. We might make it such a philosophy in terms of how we live our life, and some people argue that philosophy is divorced from the understandings of science. That's human philosophy about how to live your life is important for allowing us to live a good life. But it's not something that's inherent. It's not like we're going to find an actual law of nature that supports one particular philosophy over the other. So that would be the first, what the Buddha called a misapprehension. So the Buddha didn't agree with that idea. So the second one is that there is just one single cause. It's a very simplistic way of explaining things.
Can I ask a question?
Please, yes.
When you say genetic,
Mhm.
born to those parents, so I inherit. But being born to those parents itself is the choice of my own karma, isn't it? I don't
Well,
know, why would I be born to them?
Exactly, if we accept karma, right? So that's a different question, is there something else behind that? Right, so is it simply just that, some atoms happen to aggregate and create planet Earth, and then there was a random process of evolution that led to the arisal of different societies, and then two people decided to get together, and those are my parents, and they had me? Or is there some other intricate aspect of cause and effect behind that? Right, so Buddha essentially said yes, right? This is what a lot of scientists would honestly what we would call woo-woo. It's not a very scientific term, but I've actually seen that used in scientific papers. To say, to accuse people of believing in woo-woo. But it's just a term for anything that we label as completely ungrounded in any kind of scientific hypothesis. There's no reason to believe that other than simply faith. Now, in Buddhist philosophy, there should be some more reason to believe it than faith. If it's just taken on faith, it's not really a very stable understanding. And it might be good to question it. That's why I started with that questioning, that we ought to question that. It should be grounded in something more stable. So another question then is, if there is something else behind it, as you're pointing out, well, is it just a singular cause? Now, in modern days, it's a bit of an odd example, but it's the best one that I've seen in terms of very, very specifically. Taking this viewpoint, as far as I understand, although I haven't studied it in detail, this is just based mainly on hearsay, but it's worth considering just as a possibility. So some of you might know in my country, there's a sort of fringe religion called the Church of Scientology. Yes. Now, as I understand it, now first of all, this religion was founded by L. Ron Hubbard, who was a science fiction writer, who decided to make, as far as I understand, decided to make a religion because he thought this was a better career move than continuing to write science fiction books. He is a very creative person, so why not create a religion? So correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that his belief, his essential presentation was that human suffering is the result of a cosmic, some kind of event that occurred in the universe many aeons ago. And this is the cause of the present experiences of human beings. Now again, I'm not an expert, so please do tell me if this is a wrong understanding, but whether or not it's a wrong understanding, it's kind of irrelevant to the point. If somebody were to take this position, this would be essentially the idea that there's one cause. Another more common view would be, for example, in Christianity, the doctrine of original sin. Adam and Eve ate this apple. That one cause has polluted all of humanity up until now. It's a rather simplistic view. It's part of the reason that some people think religion is just bogus and ridiculous, that why people don't really critically analyze. They just think this one thing, that Adam and Eve, they did this one thing, and therefore all of humanity is polluted. It sounds like a fairy tale. It's not nearly as precise as some of the methodology of science. So some people then thereby reject that religion doesn't use critical analysis. So this is what the Buddha said, that there are other causes going on, he believed, other than just the physical. However, it's not so simplistic. It's not just one particular thing. And this is the wrong view that somebody can fall into, to think that suffering is so simple that we just pinpoint this one little thing and get rid of it. Now, there are many different permutations that can take, and it's not necessarily only religious ones. There are also many modern, we say, self-help gurus who say you make this one little change in your life and everything's going to be different for you. If it was so easy, then more people would be doing it. It should be more self-evident. So then the third wrong view was that, yes, there is essentially karmic cause and effect, that there is retribution for past actions, that people create causes through their sins or whatever else you want to call it, that lead to experiences of suffering in the future. But that this is controlled by some kind of a higher being who created this process, which again fails to really see the intricacy of what's happening. It makes it too simplistic. Karma, when you do an action, somebody in the sky writes it in a book, and then later they come with a book and say, see, you broke this law, now you're going to have this result. There's a particular law, this particular action has to have this exact particular result. So the Buddha said that is too simplistic. The last one is the most subtle one, which is that essentially there is a kind of permanent cause that temporarily changes. So what does this mean? It's like there is something we can point to as the cause of suffering that's not dependent upon particular conditions, right? So this could be, for example, we might see people who have the idea that very strongly that everything I experience is the result of my karma. Therefore, if I'm sick, why take medicine? Because it's just the result of my karma. There's only one cause, it's karma. It's not dependent upon particular conditions at this time. So the Buddha said that's also not the case. It's not so simplistic that we can just say it's this and not this. There's a very broad network of both causes and conditions, ripening conditions. So there might be a particular cause that leads to a particular result if the conditions are right. So yes, for example, a seed, basically an acorn, is the cause of an oak tree. An acorn is not going to cause an elm tree or a chestnut tree. But there are many other causes to an oak tree. Merely an acorn sitting in space isn't going to create an oak tree. It has to be in the soil, has to meet with concording conditions, has to have sunlight, has to have water, has to not be meet discordant conditions, be eaten by some squirrel who comes along and grabs the acorn. So there are many different things going on. And there were many people in India at the time of the Buddha who the Buddha saw as being too extreme. That they thought, well, my past karma brought this about, so therefore there's no need to take care of my body now. Whether or not I live or die, it depends on my karma. And actually, I might as well try to torture my body as much as possible to extirpate as much as possible of the negative karma. The Buddha himself applied this method for some time, recognized it as a mistaken method. Later on in his life, there's a story of him meeting some ascetics who were practicing something like this, where they were essentially torturing themselves. And they asked the Buddha, can you predict what, can you tell us what was the cause of this present suffering? Because we're experiencing enormous torture. And they expected the Buddha would say, well, it's because you did such and such act in a past life. And he said, no, it's because you're torturing your body. That's why. It's no more different, more complicated than that. Now, of course, yes, we could say, well, they were born in the body in the first place, and what was the cause of that? That is a deeper question. The Buddha didn't address that because the most immediate thing was what they were doing to themselves. If they started eating better and stopped lying out in the hot sun and whatever else they were doing to torture themselves, immediately the suffering would go away. So there are certain things that are caused by our actions now as well. So eventually what the Buddha settled upon as the cause of suffering was this combination of past actions and their imprints on the mind being ripened by present mental inclinations. So that to make it quite simple, and again, it's not as simple as this or that, but to focus on two specific aspects of that. There's the action in a past life. There's the emotion or a mental inclination of craving in the present. This craving activates the past imprints. So, for example, if I'm sitting here and I'm bored and I want to do something else, so I start thinking I'd like to do such and such thing. Maybe I'll go on vacation. That is a kind of craving. As soon as I take an action based on that kind of craving, then it's like rolling the dice. Who knows what I'm going to experience? I'm given the opportunity for my past actions to ripen by my current craving that leads me to engage in particular actions. Or on a deeper level, it's my craving that brings me into a new birth. I crave existence in some way. But that birth is going to be conditioned by past actions, whether I like it or not. So I might wish for a particular kind of birth. I might get some part of that. It really depends on what storehouse of actions of potential I have in my mind based on past actions. So the Buddha described this in quite a lot of detail, both in terms of the afflictive aspect of it. So the mental afflictions that we experience now, craving is the predominant one, but he pinpointed quite a lot of them. There's the 6 root afflictions, which is anger or hatred, and then desire, which is equivalent to craving, and then ignorance, and then pride, having a false sense of who we are, with not simply believing in a false sense of self, but exaggerating that, either for good or bad. So pride doesn't simply mean thinking I'm the best. It can also mean thinking I'm the worst and I'm worthless. That's also a kind of pride. It's exaggerating based on a wrong apprehension of self. And the ignorance aspect of it has to do more with this wrong apprehension of the self, fundamentally. And then what he called afflictive doubt, which is important to understand, it's not the same as simply doubt in general. Doubt can actually be a very positive mental factor if it leads us to question things. But here it's a kind of cynicism about things, that we hear teachings that might actually be helpful, but we are too overwhelmed by our own doubts about it, or even kind of self-doubt, not having enough confidence in oneself that I can't do it. So you never just wavering and not actually ever getting to doing anything worthwhile. And then finally, afflictive view. So having wrong beliefs about things. This is the kind of affliction that we essentially what views are ideas about what is the cause of suffering and what is the cause of happiness. So what drives us is our wish to pursue happiness and avoid suffering. But then what we do to pursue happiness and what we do to avoid suffering very much depends upon what we believe is going to lead to that. People can live their lives in all kinds of ways. Some people are very limited, that they're only having to sustain themselves day to day. But a lot of people have a little more freedom to make decisions about how they spend their time. And how they spend their time is doubtlessly going to be determined by what they believe is going to bring them happiness. So those beliefs ought to be in accordance with things, but the Buddha said in many cases, in most cases, they are not. So that's kind of afflicted belief, afflicted view. And then about karma, also the Buddha gave a very complex analysis of the workings of karma. This comes down ultimately to what we call the 12 links of dependent origination. So we're talking about the Four Noble Truths today. If we had more time, we could talk about the 12 links of dependent origination, because it's really the 12 links are a extension of the second noble truth, the truth of the cause. This is the most important one to understand. Now, I said before that suffering is, so that in some sense, yes. But when we get to really what suffering is, as I said, this pervasive compounded suffering, then it naturally leads to the second, the truth of the origin. So this interplay between the origin and the result of suffering, that's what we really need to understand. And I won't get into it today. If you're interested, I did write an article about it some years ago that you can access on the Mandala website. Or if enough people express interest, we could talk about it at some future time. But it's a quite complex question or topic about the 12 links of dependent origination. But that's just to give you some idea. That is the purpose of the 12 links, is to understand the second noble truth, truth of the cause of suffering. So, but then we'll move on for now because we have to be brief. We only have half an hour left to talk. So thirdly was the truth of cessation. The Buddha said there's an end to this. This isn't just something that has to go on inevitably. In the initial teaching, he didn't give a lot of explanation. A part of the reason is that it's understood that this is very subtle and hard to understand. Except to just say that there is such a thing as cessation. What would that mean? So, if we want to start approaching this question of the truth of cessation, the first thing to think about is, what is the nature of the mind? What is mind? Cessation would imply that what we call afflictions and this experience of suffering that we have, of these contaminated aggregates, is not the final nature of the mind. The mind itself is something that can exist without those. If it was not the case, then how could there be cessation except simply exterminating the mind? So some people have that idea also. That's why people commit suicide. Some people commit suicide just based on impulse, which is a little different, although said that idea might be underlying it. But in some cases, at least, it's based on a lot of premeditation and thought. That this essentially the cause of suffering is having a body and being born in this life. And if this body was gone, and then there's be no more mind, and there'd be no more suffering. But that's not really cessation in the way the Buddha was presenting it. Some people, even at the time of the Buddha, had that misapprehension. Some of his monks committed suicide. Actually, we as monastics, we have the vow not to kill. Now, all of the vows, any of you who know a little bit about the Vinaya, the monastic discipline, were made in response to the behavior of particular monks within the Buddhist community. None of them were just made a priori. The Buddha said, nobody can do this. He observed the behavior. He said, from now on, nobody can do that. That was a mistake. So in this case of killing, that's exactly what happened. It was not that monks got together in gangs and went out and robbed and pillaged and killed people. Actually, there were some monks who came up with the idea that the Buddha taught that everything is suffering, and therefore they were revulsed. They were too much revulsion for the physical aggregates. They took it too far. They had a misunderstanding, and they decided, therefore, what we should do is die. Then we'd be free of this. So they made an agreement with a non-Buddhist ascetic who was wandering around and agreed to kill them. And they allowed themselves to be killed. So then the Buddha noticed one day that there were a lot less people attending the assembly. What happened? And asked, and they explained to him, this is what happened. He said, this is a big misunderstanding. So cessation has to do with a very direct or very particular kind of cessation. It's not that we just eliminate the entire psychophysical aggregates. And actually, more to the point, simply dying doesn't do so. Because the mind is not something that is simply produced by the body. And therefore, eliminating the body does nothing actually to end the continuum of the mind. So the mind will just continue cycling in a future experience. So the cessation has to be something quite different. So if we understand the mind, we can understand, for example, some of the examples that are given would be like a ocean, a very turbulent ocean. Well, then, and its nature is not to be turbulent and polluted. But ocean is full of dirt, full of particles of whatever else, whatever kind of pollution that's in it, and it's very turbulent. Those are extraneous to the water itself. The water is only turbulent because it's being shaken or blown by the wind or whatever other cause is leading to that turbulence. And whatever kind of particles are there in the water are not themselves part of the water. They can be extracted from that, and you can just have a pure, like I have here in my cup, water with essentially, maybe there's some minerals in here, but for the purpose of example, it's pretty clear. And as it's sitting on the table, it's pretty placid. It's not disturbed by all kinds of external causes. So that is one example, although it's not a perfect example, because the Buddha said there's not really any perfect example in the physical world for the nature of the mind, but some of these examples are better than others, and one would be that when the causes that are leading to the agitation of the mind are extirpated, then the nature of the mind is simply to be still and peaceful. Not peaceful in the way we talked about before, where you're still within samsara, or it's still a kind of a sleeping, because there is a kind of turning away. It's like closing your eyes. Whereas here, it's a full of wakefulness. The mind is fully aware and awake, aware of things as they are. But at the same time, not disturbed by them. Seeing deeply into the reality of the situation. This is something the mind is capable of achieving. So this was the truth of cessation, is when this phenomena is achieved. It's one of the main points of disagreement among different Buddhist schools. Most of them agree on the whole, but what is the truth of suffering? And except for a few minor details about what is the truth of the cause of suffering. But about what is the truth of cessation, what does it really mean? They have quite some different divergences of opinion. Because it's a much more abstract question and not easily graspable. It's not so relatable to our ordinary experience. That's the whole point. That's why the Buddha often used the term supramundane. It's beyond anything that's experienced by an ordinary being. We can give some nice everyday examples to get some idea of what's being talked about. But it's quite beyond what we normally consider as possibilities within the realm of human experience. The Buddha said there's something completely different. Now, some schools then argue, ultimately, it's not that different. It's actually right there. It's not, if we have this idea that it's so utterly different from everything else, that can actually be an obstacle. And that's true. But at the beginning, it's presented this way. It's just a matter of how we want to think about it. Any kind of view can become extreme. And if we think that it's so utterly different and that I just need to eliminate everything else and then get to this truth of cessation, that can lead to a kind of dichotomy and some other wrong views that arise as a result of that kind of belief. Nevertheless, at the beginning, it's presented this way. It's something utterly different from anything we could imagine. The next, more concretely, is the truth of the path. So how to get there, how to get to this cessation. The Buddha gave quite concrete instructions on how to do so. This is what Buddhist practice is based on. It's not something so abstract. Some of the more advanced stages of it might seem quite otherworldly, but the basic points are quite concrete and applicable right away. So we have two different ways of looking at the structure of it. One is called the Noble Eightfold Path, which presents it in terms of 8 kinds of practices to adopt, and a more simplified version of this, which is the 3 higher trainings, which is a condensation of these 8. So the 3 higher trainings are the higher training in ethical discipline, in concentration, and in insight or wisdom. So Buddhist practice has to be based on these. In terms of other spiritual practices that were going on at the time, the Buddha essentially felt that most of them were practicing the first 2 of these, at least to some extent. Now, when we say higher training, that's what distinguishes it. The higher training in wisdom, in ethical discipline is distinguished from the ordinary training in ethical discipline of other religions or other people, in that the word higher is relating to the idea of nirvana, which is the truth of cessation, that it's with this as the goal. It's informed by an understanding of that. Nevertheless, practically speaking, it's fairly similar to what a lot of the other religious sects at the time were doing. So ethical discipline has to do with abstinence from wrong behaviors that harm others, most essentially, but also from actions that harm oneself indirectly. For example, just unrestrained pursuit of sense pleasures. It needs to be restrained because it only leads to further dissatisfaction. So a lot of the ethical discipline, especially of monastics, is based on that. And also actions that lead to disharmony between people. That's a kind of harming others, but not quite, it's a little more subtle. So a lot of it has to do with that too, especially within monastic training. There's a lot of emphasis on having harmony among practitioners, because that can easily lead to a lot of problems if practitioners cannot get along. So we have the higher training in ethical discipline, and then within the Eightfold Path, that comprises usually 3 of the Eightfold Path. I say usually because this, like everything, different people have different opinions, but we'll take it in a simplified form. So that's the, we say right speech, right action, right livelihood. Right, so right speech is using our speech in a skillful way, not lying, not speaking divisively, not speaking harshly to others, and not just using our speech wastefully. We have to recognize our speech as a powerful faculty that we have, and not just tap on and on, because if we talk mindlessly, at best, it's just a waste of time. But actually, most likely, at some subtle level, it is impelled by some kind of affliction. We're talking about complaining about what we don't like, or exaggerating the qualities and saying, I wish I had that, I wish I had this, and making other people want the same thing. So usually it's good to try to maintain silence if we don't have something useful to say, constructive to say. Doesn't have to be too extreme, but it's good to try to be careful about using our speech mindfully. And then right action. So this most grossly has to do with avoiding actions that directly harm others, like killing and stealing, but also more subtly being aware of every action we do and the impacts of it, and trying to minimize the harm that we cause. We can't eliminate it completely. If we're living in a human body, we're involved in harm all the time. Even if somebody tries to eat only foods that don't harm others, eat only non-animal foods, there's still a lot of beings that are harmed with the production of the food. So we can't just have this perfect idea where we are completely abstaining from harm. Nevertheless, we should try as much as possible to minimize that, and certainly not to intentionally cause it when we have the choice. And then finally, right livelihood. For monastics, this has to do with the way that we obtain our requisites. We have to be very careful, because as monastics, we're dependent upon donors to support us. We have to be very skillful in the way that they relate to them. But for lay people also, this can be understood as the means of livelihood, of how we make our living. It should be although we're not required by Buddhist ethical discipline to, avoid this or that job per se, except some specific ones that are very much related with harming others, like weapons production or things like that. We also just want to look at, is what we're doing, because the career is the way that we spend a lot of our time and energy, is it contributing positively to a better planet and to a better society? Sometimes it's very hard, because we obviously, as lay people, we need money. We can't just, even if our career is not the most wholesome in the sense of being directly responsible for freeing people from suffering, sometimes we really don't have a whole lot of choice in the matter. As long as it's not directly related to harming others, it also has to do a lot with how we use our ability. So even if we have a fairly mundane career that doesn't have this direct impact on benefiting others, if we use our resources in a positive way, and we treat those, our colleagues and so forth, with compassion and patience, then that's a lot better than just being directly harmful and hurtful to others. So we have to look at what we can do within our situation. So that's ethical discipline. And then higher training in concentration also is something that the Buddha recognized other religious practitioners were engaging in. Maybe not, again, the higher training, in the sense that they weren't aiming towards nirvana as the Buddha understood it, but it was a common practice in ancient India. It's not something so common today, when people withdraw and engage in prolonged periods of meditation. But nevertheless, there are a lot of popular methods, some of which are more effective than others, for enhancing mental focus, enhancing concentration, enhancing physical health, which has to do with because we understand that any kind of concentration is going to be dependent in a large means on the health of the physical body. So we take care of the body. The Buddha didn't teach to just simply ignore your body. A lot of his teachings for the monastics, for example, have to do with maintaining a healthy lifestyle, such that you can sustain long-term practice. But then what the Buddha viewed as the distinctive aspect of his practice was this higher training in wisdom. Whereas we don't just have concentration for the sake of concentration, which is what he felt a lot of the other practitioners were doing. You just bliss out on nice states of meditation. You have to use that to have penetrating insight into the nature of things. And that's why a lot of Buddhist practice revolves around study and receiving teachings and thinking about things. We have to have a nice grounding in concentration, and especially in ethical discipline. We don't just have an abstract philosophy, but within that, we have to question things and think about it a lot. That's the only way we really get to the understanding, which is what liberates us. Liberation essentially comes from right understanding. And so you can go to heaven or not, but whatever the case is, if you're in heaven, if you don't really understand how things are, there's no guarantee that things aren't, that you're very much dependent upon that situation. You're sitting there in heaven or wherever other place you're born. But having the inner wisdom, then you're much more self-sufficient. No matter where you go, you have wisdom, then you can overcome difficult circumstances. If you don't have wisdom, then you're very much dependent upon the fluctuations of what happens outside of you to protect you from things that you can't overcome yourself. So in 10 minutes, I'm not going to be able to cover the whole practice of wisdom. Just a very brief introduction. But this was the fundamental teaching of the Buddha of how to be free of this whole cycle. It has to come from understanding. If we understand it, we've transcended it. We don't have to go somewhere else. This is what was really meant by this idea that samsara and nirvana are not so different. But if we have this very strong idea that of nirvana like some kind of place that I go, where I leave behind everything else and go off on my own, in some sense, it's missing the point. Nagarjuna famously said that samsara, properly understood, is nirvana. The problem is that we fail to understand what's going on. We're lost in confusion about what are the causes of happiness and the causes of suffering. If we understand it, then we've already transcended it. And that this understanding is not just intellectual, it has to come combined with a very strong concentration to really see deeply into the nature of things. So we'll leave it at that. A lot of these topics, maybe we can continue in future talks if people are interested. But for the last 10 minutes, if any people have questions about anything I've said, maybe that's a good time for that.
It's
Yes.
not something you said, but I guess it's related. In a way. So they say that the compassion is not the direct antidote to afflictions, right?
Right.
Or even bodhicitta. But to have a kind of affliction, active gross affliction, we have to have self-grasping ignorance and the self-cherishing attitude. So why is only self-grasping ignorance its antidote, the direct antidote to afflictions? Why not other cherishing or bodhicitta?
Well,
That-
you can
that's
still
not
have
cause.
afflictions without the self-cherishing attitude. I mean, ultimately, you can't eliminate self-cherishing without proper understanding. So simply trying to cultivate compassion without wisdom to support it won't eliminate the self-cherishing attitude. Right? So we can train in trying to be nice people, to give a very concrete example. But if we don't really understand the nature of things, that can often be misguided. We try to help people, but it could be, for one thing, it could just be ineffective because we don't understand what's the cause of the problem that we're trying to solve. But also it could be driven by unconscious projections that we have because we don't really understand our own mind and our own motivation. So until we have that, simply having good intentions doesn't solve the fundamental problem. The compassion itself has to be based on wisdom. And so the fundamental error that we have, the Buddha said, was this view of an inherent self. We have this idea, a wrong view of who we really are. And so it's not, the fundamental error is not this sense of self-importance. That is external to the fundamental error. Right? We have, on the basis of having this strong sense of self that is not grounded in reality, then we can come up with all kinds of delusions about how important I am. But the fundamental issue is not that. The fundamental issue is something deeper. So the counter to that, the exact opposite of that, is going to be the view that sees the nature, the correct nature of who a person is. The idea of wishing others to be happy and not having such a strong sense of self-importance, while it's an excellent practice, is not addressing the fundamental problem.
Yeah, so you can say that you practice compassion and wisdom. I'm not saying that wisdom is not the direct antidote, but compassion is also, I mean, self-cherishing is also required along with the wrong view of self-grasping. So why is that not directly an antidote? Reflection. I understand at some level.
So you're
but they're
asking,
both
yeah, well,
required, right?
For one thing, I guess there's a twofold answer. One is that hypothetically, if one could have no self-cherishing, but still have self-grasping, there would still be affliction. It'd probably be a very nice person, but they'd still have affliction. Secondly, that even this compassion itself cannot really eliminate the self-cherishing. No matter how compassionate you become, if you don't have wisdom, the self-cherishing is still going to come in subtler ways, because it's not the compassion itself is limited until it's based on actual wisdom of things. We can see people who have very good intentions and try to help others, but they're too strongly set in their own views. And so the help that they're offering is actually very biased, even though they don't necessarily see it that way. And they might come off as really thoughtful and caring, and it's not a bad thing. I'm not criticizing that. However, we probably find examples of people, despite being very caring and wishing well of others, because of the very strong attachment to a particular way of seeing things, actually, in some cases, end up making a problem worse, because they don't really understand what is the cause of the suffering they're trying to mitigate.
You're trying to say that you may have compassion, but yet when you're so wrapped up in yourself that you place yourself above everybody else, you will continue with messing up with things.
Well, I think compassion is going to help overcome this sort of self-absorption.
Sorry.
Right, to some extent. So it's not so much that somebody is self-absorbed, but that they, on a subtler level, have a very strong viewpoint of things. Right, they have a very strong belief about things one way or the other. In one example, and I don't want to pinpoint particular people, so I'm gonna be careful about that, but at the same time, we could see an example, and classically of like missionaries, people who really, in a lot of cases, have a very sincere wish to help others, but their strong view is the way to help them is to convert them to my religion.
Right.
And so then in a lot of cases, it ends up compounding the problem. Yeah. Yeah.
So my question is related with the second. So cognitive obscurations and cognitive obscurations.
Yeah.
So removal of cognitive obscurations can lead to nirvana.
Yes.
So, out of cognitive obscurations, you know, the subtlety of the other two things to consider self-grasping ignorance and self-preaching.
Yeah.
Removal of self-grasping ignorance can lead to wisdom.
Yes.
Now, self-grasping ignorance is gross compared to self-judging.
Well, not necessarily. Like it depends what we mean by gross. We can just because you remove something first doesn't mean it's necessarily more gross than something else. Right?
We cannot completely eliminate self-judging without first eliminating self-grasping.
Not necessarily, no. I think like even like when we're talking about more philosophically speaking, but within the Prasangika school, the understanding is that a bodhisattva on the eighth ground eliminates self-grasping ignorance completely, right? A bodhisattva on the eighth ground is also limited to the self-cherishing attitude. The other schools also agree with that.
So that's what I'm saying.
So I'm not sure there's a point where somebody, where somebody has to eliminate self-grasping first, right? They've eliminated both by this eighth ground.
Yes, so Abhidhamma says that.
Yeah.
It can be limited together.
Mhm.
What I'm saying is, if something has to be limited first, anyway, that's not my question.
Mhm.
My question was that this self-grasping ignorance is cognitive in nature,
Mhm.
and cognitive obscurations are more subtle than afflictive obscurations.
But the self-grasping ignorance is cognitive in nature. The use of the word cognitive there is different than when we say cognitive obscurations, right? Self-grasping ignorance is not a cognitive obscuration. It's cognitive in the sense that it's a mind, but that's a very different use of the word cognitive, right? And that has to do with translation too. Right? In Tibetan, it's she drip, right? Shecha tamche tongwala dripar chepa. So it means that which obscures us from seeing the all knowable things. Right, so then it's translated in English as cognitive obscuration. That's actually very imprecise, right? It maybe ought to be translated differently, but it's a bit hard to express that same concept in one English word, right? Whereas you say self-grasping is cognitive. Well, if you want to use cognitive as meaning that it's a mental event, but then that also, what does that mean exactly? Then self-cherishing is also cognitive. It's also a mental event. Right, and compassion is also cognitive in that sense.
Self-cherishing is explained as more as effective.
Well, yeah, but if you want to distinguish cognitive from affective, so now we're using cognitive to mean something that has to do more with a belief rather than a habitual pattern, right? But then that's very, very, very away from the use of cognitive in the sense of cognitive obscuration, which has nothing to do at all with cognitive beliefs. It's quite the opposite. In the Prasangika system, the cognitive obscurations are not minds. And it's an imprint on the mind. It's not by definition, at least in the Sera Jey textbooks, we have a little difference from some of the other the other monasteries. That's a very subtle point. In our system, there is no such thing as a cognitive obscuration that is actually a mind. Right, it's cognitive obscuration, not in the sense that itself is cognition. It obscures cognition. Obscuration to cognition, so we say cognitive obscuration. What?
Is it affliction?
No, it's not an affliction. It's an obscuration, it's not an affliction. No. Affliction would have to be an afflictive obscuration.
Yes. So can you just again, I didn't get it 100%.
Okay.
The cognition and cognitive obscuration.
Right. So we're using English words here. But if we want to define cognition in English, there's two ways we could define it. One is just a generality for mental, right? Any kind of mental experience is cognition. Or we could use it in the more precise way you're using it, where it has to do with mental experiences that are based on some kind of reasoning process, as opposed to an affective, a wish for something. right? In either case, it's unrelated to the use of cognitive obscurations. Because cognitive obscuration doesn't mean something that is A, cognitive, B, obscuration. It means something that obscures cognition. So it's actually not cognition. Right?
So what is Tibetan word for cognitive obscuration?
Shidru. Yeah, it's a shortened, a lot of Tibetan words. It's like it's a compound hyphenated word, but it's Shecha, Tamche, Tonwala, Driparchepa, which means that which obscures seeing all knowable things.
Cognitive nature has what word in it?
What?
Cognitive nature, what is the Tibetan word for that?
For cognitive.
Or cognition?
Cognition.
Nature.
Well, I mean, actually, I'm not sure. If we want it, I think cognition might translate shepa, but then it's just mind, right? So then I would say it's synonymous with mind. Right? The use of the English word cognition is it really depends on, there's different psychology, it's different schools of psychology that probably use the word cognition quite differently. Is an I consciousness the cognition? Most people would say no, but if cognition translates shepa, then yes, it is. And so we have to be kind of careful about how we use the terms, right?
It's a question from an online friend.
Oh, okay.
People wants to, she says, thanks Gachela for the teachings. Can you share on which website I can find your article?
Oh, yeah. It should be easy. The article is on if you just search for Tenzin Gache, personalizing the 12 links of dependent origination, then I think you'll find it. But if you don't, then look on Mandala Magazine website, or actually FPMT website, because Mandala Magazine doesn't exist anymore. But the archives are stored on the FPMT website. So it should be pretty easy to find, I think. Okay. Well, I think if people are interested in any of the points I mentioned a number of things today that I said we will have time, we can talk about it, or I can talk about it in a future talk. Then please maybe submit those to Shanti or somebody else here, that we can thereby use that as a basis for considering what we might talk about in the future. So that way it can be catered to the wishes of the students. But for now, maybe we can conclude with some prayers. A few brief. So we have on page 99 here in this prayer book. Brief dedication. I dedicate whatever virtues I have ever collected for the benefit of the teachings and of sentient beings, and in particular for the essential teachings of Venerable Losang Drakpa to shine forever. And then, we can just read this in English, the short mandala offering. This ground anointed with perfumes, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru for continents, the sun, and the moon. I imagine this is a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. May my Venerable Lama's life be firm, his white divine activity spread in the 10 directions. May the torch of the teachings of Losang always remain, dispelling the darkness of all beings in the 3 realms. And then may the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen, rise and grow. May that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you with the source of all happiness and good, all powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gache, please remain until samsara ends. And we could skip to the final Lama dedication prayer. From my 2 collections, vast of space that I have amassed from working with effort at this practice for a great length of time, may it come the chief leading Buddha for all those whose mind, wits, and maya is blinded by ignorance. Even if I do not reach this state, may I be held in your loving compassion for all my lives in the Manjushri. May I find the best of the graded paths of the teachings, and may I please all the Buddhas by my practice. Using skillful means drawn by the strong force of compassion, may I clear the darkness from the minds of all beings, with the points of the path as I have discerned them. May I uphold the Buddhist teachings for a very long time. With my heart going out with great compassion for whatever direction the most precious teachings have not yet spread, or once spread have declined, may I reveal this treasure of happiness and aid. May the minds of those who wish for liberation be granted bounteous peace, and the Buddhist deeds be nourished for a long time by the graded path to enlightenment, completed due to the wondrous, virtuous conduct of the Buddhas and their sons. May all human and non-human beings who eliminate adversity and create conducive conditions for practicing the excellent paths never be parted in any of their lives from the purest path raised by the Buddhas. Whenever someone makes an effort to act in accordance with the tenfold Mahayana virtuous practices, may he always be assisted by the mighty ones, and may oceans of prosperity spread everywhere. Okay, thank you.